Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. You know, one of the most difficult things about being a moderator here at Halifax is these videos, they always steal your thunder. So I'll have to throw away my talking points and pick up where that baton has left off. I'm Yalda, Hakim, your moderator for this first panel, and I'd like to welcome our panelists here this afternoon. Could you please welcome Air Chief Marshal Sir Stuart, Senator Jeanne, Shaheen, Senator Roger Wicker, and Canada's Minister of Defence, Harjit Singh, Sajjan. So Stuart, I'll begin with you. Has America dropped the baton of leadership in the world?
Not at all, from the perspective of the alliance, which continues to adapt as it faces its 70th birthday with great pride, and 29 nations who are fully committed to a treaty drafted 70 years ago. The Washington Treaty is still worth a read, extremely well written by statesmen who had encountered the world wars you've just indicated with your videos, who thought carefully about what to do. That leadership shines through to this day. Throughout the history of the alliance, there have been inevitable tussles about how to go forward. But throughout, as a military alliance, we have adapted our command structure, responded to the challenges, embraced new members, and continue to adapt to new types of warfare and indeed new threats. So, of course, I understand why you can pose the question. Of course, we understand why it's hard to generate the narrative of support for international peace and security. But that's what we have to do. That's why events like this are so important, is create, sustain, and develop a narrative that all the people, in our case, in my case, the 29 nations, publics of those 29 sovereign nations, understand why their governments and their leaders have made the commitment to the alliance. So all military affairs take place in a political context, but we now have over 20,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen deployed in operations. The alliance has just is literally today finishing an exercise in northern Norway involving 50,000 troops, 10,000 vehicles, 250 aircraft, 65 ships, and Canada has played a leading role in that exercise. Canada has playing a leading role in the NATO training mission in Iraq. Canada is playing a leading role in the enhanced forward presence. The United States is playing a leading role everywhere. And so my responsibility within the alliance as the chairman of the military committee is to make sure that we give clear military advice to the political leadership. And that military advice is very similar to that my first predecessor would have given 70 years ago. Our strength is our solidarity, and our military advice is that we're stronger working together.
Senator Shaheen, the threat, though, from great power competition and rivals like China and Russia is intensifying, though, and it's very real.
It is, which is exactly why, as the General says, it's very important for us to continue to support NATO, to support our international efforts, because we are stronger as allies than we are individually, and that's been our history since the First World War. That's one of the lessons that hopefully we learned from that. And we need to pay attention to what's happening in Russia and China and learn from our history that our actions now have an impact on what happens in the future in terms of what Russia and China will continue to do and to think about as they look at the rest of the world.
Minister, the relevance, though, of NATO is constantly under question.
I would say, I think it's very important for anybody to ask the question, is NATO fit for purpose? I think with the challenges that we are facing around the world with the various conflicts, the aggression that Russia has shown, I think right now NATO is taking a leadership role. All the nations are also looking at what can they do to making sure that they are a credible partner. And in Canada, we too went through that. This is one of the reasons why we went through a defense policy review where the Prime Minister mandated me to making sure that NATO was well supported. So all nations are doing that. And as the NATO Secretary General has said, it's not just about cash. It's about capabilities and contributions, and you need to do all three. And the NATO unity that I have seen in the last 3 years as minister has been quite impressive. When decisions have been made by our leaders at the summits to action and having a fully operational, enhanced forward presence, multinational battle groups, fully combat capable, is impressive. To be able to put on a tremendous exercise of Trident Juncture, that is the largest exercise since the end of the Cold War. NATO is taking a leadership role and sending a very strong message of unity as well.
Senator Wicker, isn't the West a house divided right now, though? We're seeing, divisions inside countries, divisions between governments.
I think when it comes to security, not really. I would point to the communique that NATO signed just this year. It totally reiterated everyone's commitment to Article 5. I think it moved in a positive way that Donald Trump was pleased about with regard to the contributions that each member nation has with regard to national defense. I really think it was a communique that would have made Dwight Eisenhower or Henry Kissinger or John Kennedy proud. And so there are certainly divisions in every country, and there are elections in every country, and there are dynamics there. But as a whole, I think the Western Alliance is still speaking with one voice.
Minister, I'll come back to you because for many, that moment of division, though, was crystallized here in Canada during the G7, when President Trump, clashed with Prime Minister Trudeau and asked why President Putin wasn't here, and then, of course, went off to Singapore for the Kim summit. I mean, doesn't those sorts of things indicate this divide within the West?
I wouldn't look at it as a national divide. When you have, if you take NATO or G7, you got to look at our own nations and our respective democracies. Democracies are complicated. They've evolved over time. And as allies, we are going to have disagreements and we work through. But once we work through them, we are stronger together. So even though we might see moments of disagreement, moments of things that we've seen on TV, let's leave it at that. We can say that when we come together, it sends a powerful message. And I think we have demonstrated that through and through in our history. And I think that's when we look at the last 100 years. We can have our disagreements, but when the opportunity and the time comes, we do show our unity and that we are together.
So, Stuart, the democratic triumph, though, feels like it's been reversed and challenged. And it's not just this divide, a transatlantic divide. There's also division within Europe. And Peter raised the idea of populism within Europe as well. So would you say then there's a divide in Europe as well?
There are different views, as the Minister and the Senators have indicated. But I come back to the strength of the communique, which of course isn't just from one meeting. There is a sequence of really quite clear statements from the heads of state and government of the alliance since the Newport summit in Wales, since the summit in Warsaw, since the summit in Brussels, which builds on the narrative that we are stronger together. We have a single set of forces aligned to a NATO command structure which is adapting quickly to the new challenges we face. And I again commend Canada for the leadership and support for that. We have a new approach to readiness because, again, the heads of state and government asked us to develop that. We're continuing to look at new challenges such as cyber. So actually, our role in the military is to support the direction we're given. And that's what we do. The other thing, of course, which is really important, you talk about divisions in Europe, the facts on the ground are as presented in Northern Norway, which is armies, navies, and air forces working together in common cause, in solidarity for a common purpose. It is on operations in Afghanistan. It is on operations elsewhere and reassurance missions in the Balkans to continue to support a safe and secure environment. And it is important in the alliance that we also reflect that our soldiers, sailors, and airmen who are deployed need to know that there is support for their missions, and they need to know, just as those soldiers did 100 years ago, that there is support. So I'm asking for that public narrative of support for the alliance, because the world needs the alliance now more than ever. So of course you can pick stories of division, differences of view, and pick over them, but the single set of forces that we have, whether those nations are in or outside the European Union, is still supporting the alliance and its objectives as set by our political leadership as a military alliance. And anything else does not have the form and structure to deliver those military outcomes.
If I could add, in the overarching terms of what we've been talking about here, I think on the big issues, there's agreement. Among all the alliance, there's agreement we need to push back against Russia. It's been mentioned the takeover of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I think we're unified that we need to push back on this, that Russia needs to lose this one. And the United States has I think, reemphasized its commitment to that goal by saying this year, yes, we would supply the Ukrainian people with lethal weapons to get that done. I think there's agreement that we need to stand firm against international terrorism, that we need to stand firm to keep the sea lanes open, that China is a great opportunity, but it's also an adversary to our alliance. And so on the big ticket items, I would absolutely agree that we're together much more than we're apart on a thing or two.
Sajjan.
Well, the delegation from the U.S. is here under the auspices of a revised Senate NATO Observer Group that formed because we think it's important to say loudly and clearly that in the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, we support NATO. And we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that NATO gets the resources, whatever it needs, from the United States. But I think the challenge that we have is that our publics need to understand why this is important. And I remember going to the Munich Security Conference after President Trump's election, when there was a lot of dissonance among our allies about where the United States was going to be on NATO and on other international issues. And talking about the challenge that we've got with globalization and with the anxiety that the public feels in the United States, I think probably in Canada to some extent, certainly in Europe, about what's happening to people, what's their future going to look like. And we have a responsibility as leaders to educate, help people understand why NATO is important, why the international order is important, and why it's worth the risk that we take in committing to that support. And I think sometimes we forget, NATO started after everybody understood its importance because of World War II. But it's been a long time, and as Coretta Scott King says, we have to educate each generation about freedom, because we have to recommit to that. We can't assume that people are going to understand why we're doing this unless we spend time talking about it and help people understand why this is a benefit to them. And I think that's the challenge that we have right now.
And that's a really important point. And on that note, I'm going to open the floor up to the audience, and I'll take some questions, and then we'll bring it back to the panel. I believe, yeah, just one at the back.
My name is Andrei Shivchenko. I'm the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada. If we recognize rise of populism in Western democracies as a major factor shaping our policies, how is it going to affect our policies in the field of security and defense? What are the threats, what are the risks, and how should we address them?
Thank you. I'll bring that back to the panel while we're waiting for more questions.
That's more of a...
Okay, I'll start with that. It's good to see you again. I think when it comes to populism, first of all, we can't just look at it as a thing that's in isolation, that it just, as Peter mentioned, just kind of just popped up. We have to look at this as we look at any other challenges that we see around the world. Why did it come to be? And we need to look at that. And through this, there is significant anxiety in the world, whether it's some of the direct conflicts that we see, but we also see some of the other challenges that are being posed, whether it's from the mass migration of people that creates certain anxiety in populations, especially if one's economy may not be that good, the disparity between the rich. And if the people don't feel that they're increasing in their own, see a projection for themselves, you tend to blame. And we've seen this here in Canada. And it's very important for all of us to take a look at what actions we want to take. And there will be people who will take advantage of a situation like this and offer solutions. Some solutions will be perceived as positive, and some, in my opinion, are going to be negative ones. And it's very important for all of us to decide as democracies, what decisions do we want to make now so that 100 years later, our great-grandchildren don't look to us and say, what were those people thinking? And I think every nation has to answer that question for themselves, and then to determine, because this is not just about the livelihoods of populations, it can create instability as well. Political leaders will end up making decisions that may not go in the right direction, and also potentially create instability in other parts of the world if important alliances like NATO are not fully supported either.
And I think it's exacerbated by social media. We're seeing wherever there are fissures that erupt, people get on social media and they talk about that, and there's a way to communicate that we haven't seen in previous generations, and we haven't yet figured out how to respond to that.
And I suppose that's why I raised the question about divisions even within Europe, because how do you people talk about this sort of division, transatlantic division, but actually within Europe, how do you explain then what's happening in Hungary, Poland, Italy, for example?
You're the European.
That's precisely why I'm looking at you.
Well, of course, everybody gets their information in new ways, and that can be true and false. And that the false element of either single issue being exaggerated is important. And one of the lessons that the alliances learn, if I just look at Trident Juncture, for example, a recent exercise in Norway, was the critical importance, even in an organization like the Alliance, of having professional public affairs people who are first with the truth or first with the story of why we're doing what we're doing, and whether that applies or not in the Ukraine and elsewhere is for the ambassador and others to comment. So one of the other things I wanted to say this afternoon is, of course, when we talk about adaptation, maybe that word doesn't work too well with our publics, but we're changing is a word that does work to respond to the world we find ourselves in. We have to be quicker to explain as an alliance why we're doing what we're doing. And we have to be better at explaining it to sometimes skeptical public. And I don't think we should be shy about saying that. And then we need to bring on a generation of military and civilian support teams to make that message clearer, rather than trying to make complicated messages. My plea this afternoon is to simplify the message to build on the strength that the alliance already has.
Can I just add to this as well, since we're talking about Europe and division, and we also talked about this is the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. In World War I, nations from all over the world contributed and died on European soil. And it was celebrated well, but I don't think the true story of the contributions of World War I were fully made. I know for a fact that the Commonwealth nations from India, after the start of World War I was declared, 6 weeks afterwards, you had troops from India that were on European soil. Their contributions go even higher, or the troops that were from Africa. And the reason I'm getting this is not just about honoring the sacrifice of everybody. It's about also telling the story as well. Because we see about division, and there's genuine fear, and we do need to acknowledge that. We can't ignore it. But there's ways to be able to say, look at all the Commonwealth cemeteries that are there, that when at times people from around the world came together. So it's very important how we educate our citizens as well. And the reason I bring this up, because it's a very poignant moment for all of us, because the World War I, look how many casualties we actually had from all our respective nations.
Yeah, sure. Just one at the very back.
Thank you so much. I am Rasa Yuknevičienė, President of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I am from Lithuania, Lithuanian Member of Parliament. Just a week ago, I visited Eastern Ukraine, frontline, where Ukrainians defend not only their own freedom, but freedom of Europe. We feel this in Lithuania very well. So I thanked people there, and today I would like to ask a question, or maybe to make short proposal, saying that Ukrainian success could be very good example, or example for Russians themselves in long term, to understand that their behavior maybe it's not right today. So don't you think that we in NATO, in European Union, all of us, we have to unite our efforts to have more clear strategy on Ukraine, more clear understanding what do we need to succeed, and that success of Ukraine is also our success and success of Russia itself.
Success in Ukraine is one of the most important short-term issues that we have for the alliance today. So I agree with you. And I think we've responded. I already mentioned that the United States finally made the decision that a number of us have been asking for some time, and that is to provide lethal weapons to the people we hope are going to succeed. I'm chairman of the Helsinki Commission. I'm head of the American delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and right after the invasion of Ukraine, the takeover of Crimea, the false election that took place there, the Parliamentary Assembly passed Senator Cardin's resolution to the effect that Russia had violated each and every promise that we all made in the Helsinki Final Act. I think you have a good point there, ma'am, with regard to the Russian people hopefully somehow learning the lesson that is, it's not in their interest that they did this. You know, it took bodies coming back from Afghanistan to Russia a generation before that for the Russian people to understand that they had made a terrible mistake in invading Afghanistan. And so although it's hard to get information into Russia now, Putin has complete charge, almost complete charge of the media. I do think you make a very valid point, and if at some point Russian moms and dads could learn this lesson, things would be a lot better for the Russian people themselves.
And let me add, there has been bipartisan support in the American Congress for Ukraine, for the weapons, but also to address the democratic challenges that the country of Ukraine faces, and to try and provide other support. I know that that's something that Europe has done. I think Canada has been involved with that, helping the structure of democracy to address corruption issues and other issues, because, as you say, if Ukraine succeeds, not just on the war front, but in terms of a successful democracy where people are doing better and engaged in the government, then that sends a powerful lesson to Russia.
And thank you, Jeanne, for mentioning the corruption. We in NATO, the more mature democracies, very much need to pay attention to this with the more newly formed democracies, because there is corruption in Ukraine, and every time the people hear about it, it hurts our cause. And this is happening in many places in the former Yugoslavia, as all of you know, and other places. The newer breakaway, first generation emerging democracies. And this alliance needs to be very mindful of that and active along those lines. And OSCE is. Very
often, the unsung, the silent part of the alliance is all our partners and friends with whom we work quietly on capacity building, on reform, on common agreements and standards. And that is what we do. It's just not very prominent, because often that's the way it's more effective when it's quiet. But there are so many ways in which the alliance helps.
And I hope you're saying that OSCE is one of those.
Indeed.
Yes.
It's not as interesting for press to cover that kind of support as it is to cover conflict.
But certainly this administration has been incredibly tough on Russia in terms of sanctions and lifting of arms embargo as far as Ukraine is concerned.
Yes.
Yeah. So in many ways it has been clear. Yeah. Lobsang.
Let me support your comment that there is division in the NATO alliance, particularly in the European Union. NATO alliance is to defend democracy and human rights. As you said, General, that NATO military exercise is going on in Norway, but nowadays Norway refuses to speak about human rights in China. And China has formed an alliance of 16+1 of 11 European countries and 5 Balkan states. Now, just a few weeks ago, there was a universal periodic review of China at the Human Rights Council. And if you go through the list of those countries in European Union speaking for human rights and not speaking for human rights, if you look at the 16+1 group with China, they don't speak for human rights in China. So clearly there's a division. So NATO alliance is to stand for democratic values and human rights, but now they don't speak at the Human Rights Council on human rights in China.
Is that something that...
I think as a NATO alliance is represented by the respective nations, and all our respective nations stand for very strongly for human rights. And Canada has been the leader in this. Our Prime Minister has made many remarks regarding when it comes to human rights, both publicly and privately. It's very important for us to stand up for those values.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ayman Mhanna from Lebanon. It's actually about underlining some the comments made by the gentleman and answering also the question, are we tired of winning? And looking at the we. If we are Democrats, because Halifax gathers Democrats, what is the democracy about? It's about free and fair elections, but it's also about human rights, independent judiciary, independent and free media. It's about equality. Are these values winning today? Whether inside our countries, I'm not talking here about populism, I'm talking about free press in Eastern Europe and some countries, about independent judiciary in Poland and elsewhere. I'm talking about truly respecting freedom of the press everywhere. They are facing real dangers in countries represented here, but we're not seeing the same levels of funding for democratic development, for civil society organizations and human rights elsewhere. So yes, we might be still united at the military front and doing great exercises together and complementing or actually fixing some of the old flows. But are we doing what it takes so that democracy, with all its values, can keep winning? I'm not sure about this.
I mean, it's an interesting question about the fate of democracy.
Well, the point you're making about freedom of the press, I mean, all we have to do is look at the murder of journalist Khashoggi and the fact that, well, we finally have the Saudis taking some action to address what happened there. Turkey, I think, is involved in an investigation. But right now we have more reporters in jail around the world than we ever have. And the United States is not as high on the list of the freedom index as I would like to see it in terms of access to information. And we have to work on that. I mean, and the way we start is by talking about it and by trying to hold people accountable for what's happened. And, you know, I think what you saw from the Congress, at least the Senate of the United States, was an effort to hold people accountable for Khashoggi's murder and to say we need to take action to address it and to do that in a bipartisan way.
And freedom of the press is essential to our democracy. But to your point, we can't look at things in isolation either, because your point of talking about the exercises that we conduct, we have to understand the problem and we have to do this all at the same time. Because if we don't support some of the other values. We need to have a strong deterrence because this is the reality that's facing us right now. We, at the same time, we need to stand up for freedom of the press. We need to stand up for human rights. So all these things have to be done together.
I believe we have some questions on this side, one at the very back.
Thanks so much. Robert Baines, President of the NATO Association of Canada. We were talking about narrative a little bit, and really that's what storytelling is all about. I just feel that the defense departments of our countries have not been that great at telling our story, the greater narrative of the international rules-based order. And the best storytellers have always been artists. As we saw from our video here, a really great way to hammer home what is important. And I really think that I'd love to hear from you if you think that perhaps a little bit more of our defense budgets, doesn't have to be much, could go towards helping to pay for artists and some people to help express the values that we are defending. Thanks very much.
Well, you make an excellent point, and I would add to that the West is not very good at public diplomacy. You know, these command and control societies where the top leader gets to run the television station are just better at that than we are. But I would absolutely endorse what you say, and add to it that we need to get more in tune with the times and with new media in terms of telling our story.
Yeah, we have been working very hard to support something called the Global Engagement Center within the State Department that's working with the Department of Defense in the U.S. to try, and they are engaging private sector support to try and tell those stories, but also to try and respond to the misinformation that's out there on social media, which I think is one of the biggest threats to our democracy that we have today, because people don't know how to filter information. They don't know what's true and what's not, and how to make that determination. And we saw that in our 2016 elections in the United States, where the issue wasn't changing the vote count, it was influencing people's ideas and undermining their belief that our democratic process worked. And I think we've seen that in Europe as well.
Can I make a small point?
Yes, of course.
In addition to my military role, I also serve with, and I'm very proud to serve as the chairman of the Imperial War Museum in London. And in that capacity, which is an international facing museum, we still appoint war artists. We still create really quite world-class media. We're working very closely, for example, with the BBC on how to remember World War I for the next generation. My point, though, is how often creative, very high quality work is spiked, doesn't make the final cut for the public. So there is something about trying to get the story of conflict and warfare and military affairs more prominent, which I think is we have to all work on that.
Yeah.
Boris Wrzesnowski, Canadian parliamentarian and the host for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly that's taking place here this weekend. I'd like to return to this question of whether or not there's a future for NATO, or what is that future, in fact. And perhaps I'll preface it by saying NATO differentiates from ancient military alliances in its very essence, that it's an alliance of countries that share values, share similar creeds. And I'd like to reference some of the people to Article 2 of the Washington Treaty from 1949, the Canadian article, which saw this not just strictly as a military alliance, but an alliance of countries of shared values. And perhaps one of our greatest successes has been that it's an expanding alliance. That in the past, when the French had reservations about Germany joining, Canada was at the forefront, pushing for the alliance to include Germany. When there were hesitations about the Baltic states, Central European countries joining, Canada was pushing. We've had waves of refugees from those parts of the world that pushed that, yes, because it's an expanding, NATO is an expanding shield behind which we've seen freedom, democracy, and the consequent prosperity flourish. So perhaps is the future not also looking at our very successful military engagements, exercises, but looking at when do we expand next? When do we look to Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Kosovo in terms of expansion?
So the question is the future of NATO.
Well, we have one country now that's on a path to enter NATO, as you know, the Republic of North Macedonia, and they are moving along the road to progress, and Greece is now on board with that, as is the rest of NATO, so hopefully that will happen. We saw Montenegro join NATO last year, so I think that is happening, but as you point out, there are certain hurdles that countries have to achieve in order to be able to join NATO. And the shared values piece, the reform piece is a very big part of that. And so we want those countries to join if they've made those changes internally that go along with what NATO has prescribed.
I think there's certainly bipartisan support in the Senate and in the Congress for the expansions that you mentioned. There are procedural hurdles that have to be overcome, and I think we have to ask the question, do we allow Russia to, in essence, exercise a veto by taking a corner of a country, therefore making it ineligible on a technical basis? So we got a problem there with Georgia, certainly with Ukraine. I think you mentioned Moldova. So and so we need to resolve that question as an alliance, and people of goodwill and wisdom are on both sides of that issue, as you know. But there is an impulse to expand, yes, to include those others.
We've just got a question here.
I'm Colonel Nicole Schilling from Germany. As I'm a medical officer, I went to missions in Afghanistan and the Balkans about 10 years ago. When we were trained for our missions, we were always prepared that if mistakes or things happen, we have to stuck on the truth. There is no sense in hiding things because everything will become public and will have consequences. And it is extremely important for the faith and the trust in our missions and in our troops that we take this serious. The last 3.5 weeks, we talked a lot about misinformation campaigns and how they work, how they technically work, how they are really ongoing at the moment against single persons as well as against institutions, and some of us also have made this experience yet. But I'm wondering about what is more serious, the fact that we have these misinformation campaigns, or the fact that the real life every day shows us many strange stories without any misinformation campaign. But there is a lack of consequences. And my question is, what are you more worried about? About those misinformation campaigns or about those other things which are happening right now? And both of these kind of issues, in my opinion, tend people to go to the populism wings and to the extremists and to leave the moderate, democratic institution, parties, and whatever. Thank you.
I'm glad you raised this. I think this is not a new phenomenon of misinformation. There's just been new ways of being able to do it, whether it's through cyber, other nefarious ways. So this has always been there. And I think it's very important for us to adjust to that reality. And education of our own citizens is actually absolutely essential to this. I think no nation, no citizen of any nation wants to feel that they've been duped. So education is going to be very important. Anytime that we conduct operations, our troops are going to have to be extra careful to making sure how actions can be taken and in different ways. I've been very impressed with, I'll give you the example of the Canadian-led battle group in Latvia. Has many nations involved with it. They actually go out on a regular basis to connect with the communities. So when misinformation reporting comes out, they've already built that relationship with the community. So the community said, no, I've already met them. So this is just a new way of doing things, and I was very impressed. And no one asked them to do so. The military chain of command figured that out by themselves, and I have a lot of faith in our militaries within NATO to be able to take on these new challenges. But when it comes to misinformation, we have to be very mindful of, we as politicians, what type of messages are we sending, to making sure that the populations get accurate information and not go towards making decisions, whether you want to call it populism, the alt-right, or however you want to define it, that it doesn't lead to greater division, because that's what other nations like Russia want to have in our countries.
Yeah.
Matate Kamiya, Professor of International Relations at National Defense Academy of Japan. It is very encouraging to hear from the top leaders of NATO countries that NATO remains strong. But as a participant from non-NATO, non-European country, I would like to stress that in order for democracy to keep winning against challenges, it is not sufficient that NATO remains strong, because today the challenge to democracy, challenge to liberal international rules-based order, that is increasingly global. There's China, there's other challenges in the world, and to China, Japan, Australia, India, United States, ROK, those countries are trying to counter the challenges in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, or whichever term you use. So I think I would like to ask NATO leaders to seek for more cooperation with non-NATO democracies in the world globally. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you're pleased with what you've seen coming out of the Congress the last year or two. We've ended defense sequestration. Our admirals and generals told us we need a 355-ship Navy, up from 270, a woefully low number. And not only have we put the money toward the first steps of that, we put it in the National Defense Authorization Act and made it the law of the land, and Donald Trump signed it. Much of what we'll be doing with an enhanced fleet will be keeping the lanes open and keeping international freedom and commerce going in the Pacific. And certainly, I think our NATOs are with us on that. But we are into a 2-year buildup, which Jeanne, I think we're going to continue now under a divided Congress and this administration.
I hesitate to bring this up, but one of the other areas that is very important to addressing shared values and developing relationships is trade. And as we know, right now, we've taken some actions in the United States that are concerning, I think, with respect to the benefits that we have gotten in the past from those trade relationships. I'm pleased that we're not here in Canada without a revised NAFTA agreement, as we were last year. But, you know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that has continued, that the United States is not participating in, I think was one of those ways that we could provide support and build on those relationships in Southeast Asia, and we have taken ourselves out of that discussion now.
Little bit of populism in the United States stopped the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There was talk about doing this in a lame duck in 2016 after the election. You had Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, both major party nominees for president, campaigning against TPP and saying what a horrible thing it was. There's no way Jeanne and I could have come in after the election on a bipartisan basis and ratified that. I regret that, but that's the political reality of why we don't have TPP. I would say this to my dear friend and colleague, the red Jeanne Shaheen, who I adore, and who's a fellow graduate of University of Mississippi, which I think is why the people of New Hampshire responded so well to.
I'm sure it is.
There's rhetoric about trade agreements, and then there's the reality. I never thought, I never thought we had the worst agreement ever between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, but it needed tweaking, and lo and behold, here we are with USMCA. Mexico signed off on it, and somehow the milk issue was settled, and we have a pretty decent agreement among Mexico, the United States, and Canada. We have the European Union leadership coming over to the United States telling the president, we want to get to zero tariffs as quickly as possible. I mean, who would have believed that a year ago, that we would have such a thing? And I do think, with regard to China, the president is being very, very strong. It's hurting American agriculture, but my farmers say we're willing to give this president some leeway and endure a little pain if we can stop the cheating and stealing and the manipulation that China has been engaged in. So there's a positive story that doesn't really match the rhetoric that sometimes we're hearing out of Washington.
Well, on the military side of your question, Professor, there are many ways of acting as partners and friends. And quite often at these events, we always like to focus on strategy and high-level conversations, quite rightly. But actually, for example, the NATO Defense College in Rome is very active in engaging with other parts of the world. Military education, sort of areas where militaries can understand each other's concerns from different regions, is very much the bread and butter of NATO's partnership activity.
I was just going to say, and also, global trade is very important to our nations, for our citizens. And as much as we talk about NATO, yes, in U.S., Canada, we look to the Pacific. And we have done a lot more coordinated work on the security side of things, because at the end of the day, global trade can't function if you don't have a secure environment to work from. So there has been greater emphasis in the Asia Pacific. And I think even with some of the security challenges that we face, we can have come to an agreement to making sure that trade can to increase while at the same time dealing with some of those challenges.
We've just got a couple of minutes to go, but just listening to some of the questions from the audience here, the feeling I get is there is a sense that there's a fear from some quarters in the world that the United States is withdrawing from the world. And so I suppose, is there a way of you giving some kind of reassurance that that isn't necessarily happening?
I think the challenge is the rhetoric. It is the president's statements versus American actions versus American commitments in terms of resources. And that's where the disconnect is. And again, wherever I go, Congress, there is a bipartisan commitment in Congress to invest in the world, to continue to be engaged. The resources are there. But people say, well, but the president said this. And so that creates a disconnect. But I think if you look at what our actions have been, if you look at where we've been in terms of support for NATO, where we've been, all of the issues that we've talked about here, that Americans' actions have continued to engage in the international community. And that is the commitment that we've had since World War I for the last 100 years. So I think the challenge has been that sometimes the president's rhetoric does not reflect the commitment that is there on the ground in resources and on the part of all of the bureaucracy of government within America.
And I would say Senator Shaheen is largely correct. I think the president says he's not a globalist, he's a nationalist. And yet, he's sending his Secretary of State all over the world trying to solve problems. Our Secretary of Defense is the general who famously told the Armed Services Committee, if you cut the State Department, I've got to buy more ammunition. And so what is actually happening, and I go back to the NATO communique, I think the president is more of someone who believes that we need to convince the American people that our international agreements, that our global responsibilities need to be shown to be in the national interest.
Just as well.
And to that extent, I think we're in a good position to make that case.
I just want to back them up, sorry. This is a very important point. I had the privilege of working with the former Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, and now with Secretary Mattis. And we, in fact, actually, there's been greater cooperation, more action, and on the security side of things, we're actually being able to have a greater discussion and turn it into action far faster now. So I think in this case here, the U.S. should be judged on their actions, and very pleased and very privileged to be able to work with Secretary Mattis.
Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, if you could thank my panelists for this thoughtful discussion.